Hey guys, tonight we sink into a time when falling in love wasn't really the point at all. You're easing back on your pillow, maybe the sheets are just a little cool against your legs, and the hum of the fan keeps the room steady. But in your mind, you're suddenly standing in a world where a wedding wasn't about romance. It was a family's way of calculating profits, protecting names, and stitching together alliances like fabric on a loom. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always strange fun to see someone in New York listening at 11 p.m. while another is wide awake in Manila at 9 a.m. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're stepping onto a cobblestone street in the 16th century. The lamps burn low, the windows of townhouses are shuttered, and behind those walls parents are whispering like CEOs in a late-night board meeting. They aren't debating whether their daughter has a crush on the baker's apprentice. They're calculating how much land does he own? What's his family's standing at the guild? Will this alliance secure wool contracts or keep the vineyard solvent through another harsh winter? This is marriage as transaction, romance only if it fit neatly into the spreadsheet of survival. If you squint, it looks suspiciously like the opening scene of a corporate negotiation. Father leaning forward, quill in hand, mother folding her hands, just so, the young man's relatives measuring every sentence for double meaning. One mainstream fact sits plainly here. In much of medieval and early modern Europe, the idea of marriage for love was considered downright reckless. Historians point to noble families like the Medicis or the Tudors who used marriages as chess pieces on the political board. To marry simply because of affection, that was like buying a horse because you thought it had kind eyes. You probably wouldn't survive this. The quirky tidbit? Some families literally wrote their children's qualities in account books. You might find lines noting, "Daughter Catherine, age 16, brings 2 silken gowns and 1 silver comb, considered suitable." Yes, you were basically a bullet point in a ledger. And yet scholars still argue whether everyone truly swallowed this business-like model. Was love completely absent, or did couples quietly nurture affection behind the facade? Some argue that pockets of tender devotion always seeped through the cracks, recorded in poems and secret letters. Others think those rare examples were exaggerated, like cherry-picked love stories held up as proof that passion still mattered. You, standing on that street, imagine the tension. A boy and girl meet eyes briefly during a church service. He smiles. She looks away, cheeks flushed. Sweet, right? But the family's minds are already whirring. Does his uncle's estate border ours? Would combining fields double the grain yield? You shuffle forward into the marketplace where vendors shout prices for onions and cloth and gossip threads between the stalls. One old woman leans over to another, muttering, "Heard the miller's boy's betrothed to a girl who will bring 2 cows into the marriage." Imagine Tinder bios written like that. Owns livestock, good dowry potential, parents respected. Of course, not everyone was wealthy or noble. Among peasants, the calculation was simpler but no less real. A girl from a farming family needed a husband who could provide an extra pair of hands, someone whose parents had a plough to lend, someone whose siblings could help repair the roof. Without these conditions, marrying for love might mean starving for love. And yet the contradiction remains. Stories like Romeo and Juliet weren't written in a vacuum. The play might be dramatic and tragic, but it resonated precisely because audiences recognized the impossible friction between love and the family's contract-driven expectations. The drama wasn't just fiction, it was Tuesday. You lean into this thought. Maybe you, sitting here centuries later, aren't so far removed. Parents still ask sly questions about careers, about stability, about whether the person you're dating comes from a good family. Swap estates for mortgage approvals, and you might just hear the same tune humming softly beneath the modern melody of romance. As you wander back through those lamplit alleys, you notice one house glowing a little brighter. Inside, a negotiation has begun, parchment spread out, coins stacked carefully, heads nodding in rhythm. A young couple stands silently in the corner, practically background props in their own story. You sense their nervousness. They've probably spoken fewer words to each other than you exchange with a stranger at the grocery store today. The candle drips, the ink scratches, and with each stroke a lifetime is arranged. You slip quietly from that candlelit negotiation and follow the trail of ink-stained contracts into a larger pattern, one that sprawls across entire towns and even nations. Here, the dowry sits heavy on the table, like a trunk of silver no one dares to open, but everyone knows is there. A marriage might have begun with whispers, but it was sealed with numbers, and you can practically hear the mental abacus clicking away in the heads of both families. The dowry, in simplest terms, was a transfer of wealth from the bride's family to the groom's household. At least that's the mainstream definition you'll find in history books, but when you lean in closer, you realize it wasn't always just gold or land. Sometimes it was livestock, sometimes bolts of fabric, and sometimes even a promise of labor, like, "We'll help you harvest for the next 5 years." Try slipping that into a wedding registry today. 2 sheep, 3 pigs, and 1 cousin who's good at mending fences. It feels so clinical. The bride, often a teenager, had little say in the amount or content of her dowry. Fathers might argue over what was included, uncles might tally the worth of fields or barrels of grain, and mothers might haggle about how many gowns or linen should be part of the bundle. You, hovering in the background like an invisible guest, sensed the strange mixture of pride and panic. Too small a dowry, and your daughter looks unworthy. Too generous, and you bankrupt your household. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Renaissance Florence, dowries became such a financial strain that the city actually set up a government-run dowry fund. Families could deposit money early in a girl's life, almost like a savings account, which would then accrue interest until her marriage. Historians still argue whether this was a benevolent solution or just another way for governments to profit off people's desperation to marry their daughters well. Step into a merchant's home for a moment. The table is spread with parchment, the ink pot dark and threatening. The future groom's relatives ask questions that sound less like courtship and more like loan negotiations. And how many vineyards exactly? What condition are the vines in? Are the olive presses included? You might imagine an accountant in the corner adjusting his spectacles and noting, "Yes, satisfactory, conditional upon proper upkeep of the barrels." Meanwhile, the bride might be off in another room, fingers trailing across a small mirror, imagining what her wedding gown might look like, or perhaps wondering what her future husband's laugh sounds like. But back at the table, her worth is reduced to acreage and coin stacks. Of course, the dowry was never a one-way street. The groom's side was expected to provide a mourning gift, or jointure, something to secure the bride if she became a widow. That sounds sweet in theory, but often it was carefully calculated too. It was less about comfort and more about ensuring her survival didn't drain the family estate. Imagine a husband saying, "Don't worry, darling, if I die, you'll get exactly 1/3 of the orchard's apple profits." Romantic, right? And here's where humour sneaks in. Some dowry lists read like oddly practical shopping receipts. You find entries like 3 copper pots, 1 iron spit, 6 hens, and a donkey of sound mind. A donkey of sound mind, as though they feared slipping in one that was neurotic. If you close your eyes, you can almost smell the parchment, feel the tension, and hear the faint scratching of quills. The family's future is being weighed not by affection, but by fiscal prudence. This wasn't just two people coming together, it was a microeconomy being reshaped. The truth is, without these exchanges, many families couldn't survive. Land needed to be consolidated, debts repaid, alliances secured. You realize that a dowry wasn't just a gift, it was an investment, insurance, and sometimes a gamble. A bad match could ruin a family as swiftly as a failed business deal. And so you step back from the table and drift into the cool night air, the echo of numbers and promises still clinging to you. You see the silhouettes of other homes, other negotiations. In each, candles flicker, fathers debate, and daughters wait. You can almost hear the collective sigh of an entire society where love has to queue politely behind livestock, coin, and linens. You drift further down the crooked lanes of town, the night growing quieter, except for the occasional bark of a dog or the creak of a tavern door. You slip into a courtyard where another discussion is underway, not about how many sheep or barrels of wine will accompany a bride, but about something more subtle, more invisible, whether she even consents to this arrangement. Consent, of course, is a tricky word in this world. You notice how often it was defined less by the young people themselves and more by the parents leaning over them. The official line was that marriage required mutual agreement, but in practice, the power of fathers and guardians loomed large. You imagine a girl, perhaps 16, asked whether she approves of the match. Her yes might be whispered under the weight of expectation, with her mother's hand firmly on her shoulder. One mainstream historical fact in medieval canon law, both parties technically had to say, "I do," for a marriage to be valid. Without spoken consent, the church argued, no true union existed. But in reality, when your family's fortune depended on sealing a deal, that little phrase, "I do," could be more coerced than chosen. Here's the quirky tidbit. Sometimes couples tried to prove a secret marriage simply by claiming they had exchanged vows privately. A whispered "I take thee" under an oak tree could, legally speaking, bind them together. Historians still argue whether this loophole gave young people more power or simply created chaos in the courts when fathers found out their daughters had eloped with farmhands. You picture one such moment, a nervous young man stammering his vows in a field while his sweetheart clutches his hand, knowing full well her father would never approve. They believe themselves married, but by dawn their families are in uproar. The local priest called in, the lawyers sharpening their quills. Back in the courtyard, you notice the delicate dance of persuasion. A father might say, "My dear, this match is advantageous. You will be cared for. You will not want for bread." The daughter nods because to refuse would mean more than just disobedience. It could mean dishonor, estrangement, or worse. The son, meanwhile, might be pushed toward a bride who brings land but inspires no spark in his chest. He shrugs, resigned to a future of polite indifference. And yet, here's where your modern mind can't help but intervene. You think about your own life, the way people today fight tooth and nail for the right to marry for love, to choose partners freely, to swipe left or right with abandon. Imagine trying to explain Tinder to a 17th century villager. They'd likely nod gravely and say, "Ah, yes, an efficient dowry selection tool." The scholars who study this period sometimes bicker like neighbors over a fence. Was courtship purely coercion, with young people dragged like pawns across the board? Or did they have more agency than we assume, slipping subtle hints to their parents, cleverly steering negotiations? Maybe the truth lies somewhere in between, like a card game where the deck is stacked, but you still try to play your hand with a wink and a bluff. You linger on one face in particular, a girl sitting on the edge of her bed, the candle burning low. She's been told she will marry the merchant's son. She knows he's kind enough, but she has only exchanged a few words with him, awkward phrases over trays of figs at the market. She sighs, not in protest, but in resignation. Her choice is already made, her voice an echo in the chamber of family ambition. And still some resisted. Stories float through the centuries of daughters refusing matches, sons fleeing responsibility, and families torn apart by stubborn defiance. The consequences were harsh: social shame, loss of inheritance, sometimes even exile from the family's circle. But once in a while, a spark of independence lit up, and you can almost feel the daring thrill of someone saying, "No." You leave the courtyard with its whispering shadows and continue into the night, the uneasy tension between consent and coercion still clinging to your thoughts. The cobblestones beneath your feet remind you of the rigid order of this society, stone after stone, laid to keep everyone in line. Yet here and there you notice cracks, little weeds sprouting up, as if love itself tried to push through despite the weight pressing down upon it. You wander from the silent courtyard toward a noisier square where the flicker of torches casts long shadows and the hum of conversation feels like a marketplace of rumours. Here, courtship isn't confined to drawing rooms and parental lectures. It has spilled into the streets, into taverns, and into the murmur of networks that function almost like a medieval version of LinkedIn. You realize that matchmaking was not just a family affair, but a whole community enterprise fueled by gossip, alliances, and professionals who made a living from brokering love like stock traders. A mainstream fact anchors you here. In early modern Europe and much of Asia, professional matchmakers were common and respected, often hired by families to find a suitable spouse. They were called different things: go-betweens, brokers, aunties. But their purpose was clear. They gathered information, sized up prospects, and presented options. Think of them as the original algorithm, except instead of coding, they worked with whispered reputations and carefully folded notes. You step closer to one such broker, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a quicker tongue. She's speaking with a merchant's wife, assuring her that the boy from the next town not only comes with 3 acres of decent pasture, but also has the good sense not to drink too much ale. You watch her scribble notes in a little book, tallying advantages like a shrewd accountant. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some matchmakers were known to embellish, outright lie. There are records of brokers boasting that a man had strong teeth and good morals, only for the bride to discover he was missing molars and owed debts to half the town. Historians still argue whether these fibs were rare exaggerations or an unavoidable part of the matchmaking hustle. You drift further into the square where gossip acts as a secondary network. Women at wells, men at guild halls, apprentices in alehouses all share tidbits about who's available, who's respectable, and who has land that might double nicely with yours. You can almost hear the whispers spiraling through the night. Did you hear the tailor's son secured a betrothal in York? Apparently, her dowry includes an orchard. This buzz worked as the society's rumor-driven database. No need for swiping left. You just needed an aunt with sharp ears. But matchmaking wasn't only about money. Reputation mattered just as much and often more. A small scandal could tank a girl's prospects the way a bad credit score haunts someone today. A whispered accusation of impropriety, true or not, might send parents scrambling to secure a match before the gossip grew legs. And you, listening to it all, can't help but smirk at the parallels. Isn't this just the old-fashioned version of someone Googling your name before a first date? Of course, families sometimes relied on written lists, as if they were drafting resumes. You can picture a father dictating, daughter, 20 years, good health, skilled in embroidery, moderate dowry. It's less of a dating profile and more of a job application. In fact, some local papers in later centuries literally published marriage ads. Wanted, gentleman of means, seeks respectable young lady with dowry, fondness for poultry, a bonus. And yet, beneath this machinery, you sense the flicker of human hearts. A boy might bribe a broker to whisper his name more favorably. A girl might drop hints to her aunt about who she found handsome. The machinery of matchmaking might look clinical, but it was also porous, full of little human nudges and manipulations. You linger on one scene, two mothers standing close together in church after the sermon. Their words are polite, but the undertone is sharp, like blades hidden under lace. One asks casually, "Your daughter seems well. Has she had any suitors?" The other, feigning humility, replies, "Oh, just one or two inquiries, nothing serious." You know she's lying. Her husband has been fielding offers all week. The air is thick with strategy, every phrase weighed as carefully as coins in a purse. As you leave the square, the echo of this strange economy follows you. You think about your own world, about dating apps and dinner parties, blind dates and swipe-based matchmaking. Strip away the glow of screens and the language of love, and you wonder, are we really so different? Families may no longer hire brokers with sharp tongues, but algorithms, friends, and social circles still nudge us, still shape our choices, still whisper reputations into our ears. The torches gutter low as the night stretches on, and you can almost hear the brokers tallying another successful match in their little books, satisfied as though they had just closed a business deal. The marketplace hum subsides, leaving you with the strange realization that in this world, even romance needed a middleman. You follow the trail of these sharp-eyed brokers into quieter chambers where romance is disguised as ink on parchment. Here, the flicker of candles illuminates desks stacked with folded paper, sealed with wax, tied with ribbon. You realize you've stepped into a world where love letters aren't just sentimental keepsakes. They're legal ammunition, little contracts dressed up as poetry. The mainstream fact is clear. In many courts across Europe, from Tudor England to Bourbon France, love letters could be introduced as evidence of intent to marry. A scribbled line like, "I promise myself to you," might be binding enough to convince a judge that a betrothal existed. Forget the bouquet of roses. Your proof of love might one day be subpoenaed. You lean over the shoulder of a young scribe, his hand cramping as he pens another draft. He tries to lace the page with affection, "My dearest, my only." But then he slips in phrases that sound suspiciously contractual. "I shall ever be faithful, and you shall be mine as long as both our houses agree." You smirk. It's like reading a prenup disguised as Shakespeare. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some families actually hired professional letter writers to help their sons or daughters compose these notes. Imagine outsourcing your flirtation. Yes, could you make it sound more romantic, but also legally watertight? There are records of lawyers moonlighting as ghostwriters of passion, crafting sentences that balance tender devotion with airtight clauses. But historians still argue whether young people themselves truly understood the legal risks of these letters, or if they simply wrote them in a haze of infatuation, never imagining their words could be dragged before a magistrate. Perhaps the youth believed they were crafting private expressions of the heart, while their parents and communities read them as signed contracts. You picture one scene, a girl hidden behind a tapestry, clutching a folded parchment. She reads the words over and over, heart racing. To her, the letter is proof of love, a secret flame. To her father, once discovered, it's leverage, a way to push the boy's family into accepting a formal betrothal. The candlelight wavers, and you almost feel her joy collapsing under the weight of family politics. Another letter from a boy apprenticed in a guild is filled with clumsy rhymes. He compares his sweetheart's eyes to polished brass and her cheeks to ripe apples. It's earnest, if not eloquent, but tucked in the middle is a line, "I pledge myself to thee and to none other, as God is my witness." Sweet? Yes. Legally binding? Potentially disastrous. That sentence could cost him his bachelorhood, whether he intended it or not. The irony is delicious. Romance trying to break free, but trapped in the language of obligation. You can't help but imagine the modern equivalent, text messages presented in court as contracts. You literally wrote "forever and always," that holds up in law. These letters weren't just about emotions. They were bargaining chips. Parents might seize them, wave them in a suitor's face, and insist, "Your son has committed himself. Here are his words, sealed with his own hand." The boy might pale, realizing that his midnight poetry has become a rope binding him tighter than any dowry agreement. And yet, hidden between all this calculation, there were genuine sparks. The ink sometimes trembled with real passion. The metaphors, clumsy or grand, revealed hearts beating beneath the armor of family ambition. You can almost hear the sighs, the shy laughter, the thrill of knowing that across town someone is reading your words by candlelight. You drift out of the chamber with its stacks of parchment and wax seals, the air thick with the smell of ink. You imagine these fragile letters scattered across centuries, folded into trunks tucked under floorboards, rediscovered centuries later by archivists who tilt their heads and wonder, was this romance or was this business? The answer, like so much in this world, lies somewhere in between. You slip away from the chambers stacked with letters and wander into a print shop, the heavy scent of ink and the steady rhythm of a press filling the air. Wooden type clacks into place, sheets of paper are pressed, and apprentices scurry about with ink-stained hands. This is where courtship steps out of private whispers and enters public instruction, because in the age of growing print culture, people began learning how to love from books, pamphlets, and sermons. The mainstream fact is that by the 17th and 18th centuries, etiquette manuals and conduct books became popular in Europe and the colonies, spelling out exactly how a gentleman or lady should behave during courtship. You didn't just stumble through flirtation, you followed a manual, as though romance came with IKEA-style instructions. Picture a guidebook on a shelf, its title in florid script, The Complete Gentleman's Guide to Wooing and Winning. Inside you'd find lines like, "A suitor must not gaze too long upon a maiden, lest he appear foolish. Neither must he avert his eyes entirely, lest he appear cowardly." You chuckle, because this sounds suspiciously like modern dating advice columns, only written with quills instead of clickbait headlines. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some pamphlets included entire model conversations for would-be lovers. Imagine flipping pages to find a scripted dialogue. Gentleman: "Fair lady, might I trouble you for a dance?" Lady: "Sir, I would be honoured, provided my aunt gives consent." It's basically Tinder banter with subtitles. Historians still argue whether people actually followed these scripts or whether they treated them more like entertainment, laughing at the absurd stiffness of printed romance. Perhaps for some they were deadly serious, anxious young men memorizing lines before stepping into a dance hall. For others, maybe it was the equivalent of reading a satirical BuzzFeed article on 10 things never to say on a first date. You step deeper into the shop and notice another genre stacked in piles: sermons. Preachers often thundered about proper courtship from the pulpit, turning romance into a moral lecture. "Beware the young man who flatters without purpose," one might declare, while parishioners nod gravely, secretly replaying in their minds the compliment they received at the last fair. And yet the print revolution did more than dictate manners. It also spread the idea that romance itself could be idealized. Ballads and chapbooks circulated tales of lovesick shepherds, star-crossed maidens, and knights who would duel for affection. Even if marriages were built like contracts, these little printed fantasies kept alive the whisper that love might still matter. Imagine a girl in a village cottage, secretly buying a penny ballad that sings of undying devotion. She reads it by the firelight, her cheeks warming, even as she knows her marriage will likely be negotiated by her father over cider and coin. For her, those printed words are a window, a dream of a different kind of love, a reminder that passion still existed somewhere beyond the ledger books. Of course, print also created its own scandals. Broadsides mocking failed courtships were sometimes sold in marketplaces. You picture a crude cartoon of a rejected suitor, mocked for his awkward proposal, his nose exaggerated into a ridiculous beak. The town laughs, the poor man blushes, and the lesson is clear. Courtship wasn't just private, it was public theatre, documented in ink. You drift from the press shop into the street where printed papers flutter in the wind, pasted to walls, exchanged in taverns, read aloud at firesides. Each page shapes the expectations of a generation, teaching them that love is a script, a sermon, a satire, and, just maybe, a possibility. The cobblestones echo under your feet as you walk on, realizing that once the printed word entered the world of courtship, romance would never again be entirely private. Every glance, every word, every gift could now be measured against what people had read in their manuals, their ballads, their pamphlets. And you wonder quietly whether anyone truly kissed without hearing an author's voice whispering instructions in the back of their mind. You leave the print shop behind, the air still tinged with ink and paper dust, and drift toward the sound of music. Somewhere ahead, a fiddle scrapes, feet shuffle, and laughter rises like smoke into the night. You've arrived at one of the few sanctioned arenas where young people could meet under watchful eyes. Public rituals of courting which look suspiciously like community business fairs dressed up with dancing and cider. The mainstream fact here, in many villages and towns, courtship wasn't a private affair at all. It unfolded in communal spaces like church festivals, harvest dances, and parish gatherings. These weren't spontaneous moments of romance. They were orchestrated opportunities where families displayed their children like prized goods at a market stall. Imagine a midsummer fair, garlands of flowers strung between stalls, the air thick with roasting meat and spilled ale. Parents hover in clusters, casually but pointedly introducing their sons and daughters to one another. "My William is strong with the plough," one mother brags, while another counters, "Our Anne spins the finest wool in the parish." It's less about flirting and more about LinkedIn networking with flower crowns. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some parts of England and Germany, young men and women literally lined up for courting games, supervised by the elders. One game involved exchanging gloves or apples, which might symbolize interest, or just an excuse to test whether the young man had clean fingernails. Historians still argue whether these games gave young people a rare chance to express choice, or whether they were merely theatrical gestures under the ever-present gaze of parents. You lean against a post and watch as a group of girls, cheeks flushed, twirl in a circle while boys stand at the edge, shifting awkwardly, trying to summon the courage to step in. The fiddler plays faster, the dance spins tighter, and all the while the mothers glance over with narrowed eyes, calculating silently. But these rituals weren't limited to dances. At church on Sunday, the post-service mingling acted like a silent marketplace. Families lingered just a little longer in the churchyard, arranging for their sons to walk a particular girl home, conveniently taking the longer route past fertile fields that whispered of future harvests. You imagine a girl clutching her prayer book, acutely aware that every step is being monitored, every glance catalogued. And still, within these public rituals, sparks sometimes flew. a stolen smile, a whispered joke, a hand lingering just a second too long during a dance. These tiny rebellions made the rigid system bearable. For the young, every laugh carried double meaning. Yes, it's a game for the parents, but maybe it's also something real. One evening, you picture a maypole celebration, ribbons twisting like strands of fate. A boy pulls a ribbon taut, his hand brushing against a girl's. For an instant she meets his eyes, her cheeks blooming red. Their parents watch from the sidelines, nodding approval. Not because of love, but because both families own adjacent plots of land. The couple may think it's fate. The families know it's profit. The odd part? Everyone was in on the performance. The youth played at spontaneity, the parents pretended to allow freedom, and the community hummed with gossip to keep the whole thing running. It was theatre, carefully staged, but theatre that sometimes fooled even the actors into believing. And you, drifting through the warm air, can't help but think of your own world. Speed dating events, school dances, even wedding expos, all carry the same whiff of commerce disguised as celebration. Strip away the electric lights and the DJ, and you might just find yourself back under the maypole. As the music fades and the dancers collapse in laughter, you notice the real work is happening at the edges. Fathers shake hands, mothers exchange quiet promises, and the foundation of another contract is quietly laid. The night may sparkle with music, but the ink of negotiation is already drying. You step away from the maypole and into a dim parlour where the flicker of firelight casts long shadows across the furniture. The music of the festival is gone, replaced by the stiff hush of a room where every word counts. You realize you've entered the chaperone's domain, the ever-present figure whose sole job was to make sure courtship never wandered off the narrow path of respectability. The mainstream fact is this. In many early modern and Victorian households, young men and women were almost never allowed to meet unaccompanied. A chaperone, a mother, aunt, older sibling, or hired guardian, sat nearby, sometimes literally between them, ensuring that romance stayed neatly inside its financial and moral box. It was less about protection from danger and more about protecting reputations, because a girl who compromised her honor compromised her dowry's value. You sit quietly in the corner of one such parlor. A young couple occupies stiff-backed chairs on opposite sides of a rug. Between them, an aunt knits furiously, her needles clicking like a metronome of doom. The young man tries to speak. The weather has been agreeable. The girl answers softly. Yes, quite. Their eyes flicker toward one another, but the aunt clears her throat with such force that you're certain she could extinguish the fireplace. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some etiquette guides recommended placing a literal chair between courting couples. The chaperone chair, as it was jokingly called, acted like a buffer zone, an unspoken reminder that if hands strayed, someone was close enough to slap them away. You imagine how modern dating would look if you had to bring your aunt to Starbucks and seat her between you and your date, tay in hand. Historians still argue whether chaperones were as strict as etiquette books imply, or whether many of them turned a blind eye, pretending not to notice subtle flirtations. Perhaps some chaperones, remembering their own youth, allowed small rebellions to pass under the radar. Others likely took pride in their vigilance, guarding reputations as fiercely as bankers guard vaults. You picture another scene, a promenade in the park. Young couples walk in twos, but always with a duenna, an older woman trailing behind like a human watchdog. She holds her shawl tightly, eyes darting, ears tuned for whispers. The couple speaks in coded language. Do you enjoy the roses here? Yes, they remind me of possibilities. She smiles, he grins, and the duenna narrows her gaze, unconvinced. The system was rigid, but of course, youth always finds loopholes. A dropped handkerchief, a coded phrase, a book with words underlined. These became the secret languages of the watched. The parlour may have been guarded, but the human heart remained inventive. And yet the stakes were high. A young woman caught alone with a man could see her reputation tarnished, her marriage prospects plummet, and her family's investment unravel. Parents feared scandal the way modern investors fear stock crashes. And so the chaperone wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a line of defense against social ruin. The irony, of course, is that sometimes the chaperone became an unwitting accomplice. There are stories of guardians nodding off in their chairs, knitting needles slipping from their hands, while the couple whispered softly across the room, or of chaperones bribed with sweetmeats or small gifts to take a walk in the garden and leave the lovers alone for just 10 minutes. You smirk at the image, the watchdog happily distracted with cake. You walk out of the parlour, the aunt's knitting needles still clacking behind you, and step back into the cool evening. The system is clear in your mind now. Matchmaking set the stage, public rituals kept up appearances, but chaperones were the daily enforcers of the grand illusion. Love could peek out in sly glances and coded words, but always under the shadow of clicking needles and narrowed eyes. You step from the parlour into a wide square buzzing with energy, the kind that feels less like celebration and more like commerce. Banners flap, stalls creak, voices rise in a steady hum. You've wandered into what people of the time literally called marriage markets, gatherings where eligible men and women were paraded, inspected, and weighed not by affection, but by assets. The mainstream fact, marriage markets were real, particularly in 17th and 18th century Europe as well as parts of Asia. Families openly brought their sons and daughters to fairs or gatherings where courtship was conducted with the same seriousness as buying land or wool. It wasn't just metaphorical, this was matchmaking turned into an open-air bazaar. You move slowly through the crowd. To your left, a father proudly gestures toward his son, who stands like a prize ram at auction. Healthy, strong, apprenticed to a guild, he says. To your right, a mother describes her daughter's dowry with the precision of an accountant. 2 trunks of linens, 3 silver spoons, and the promise of half an orchard. You glance up at the girl herself, cheeks burning with embarrassment as though she's a product on display. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some English towns, a literal marriage market Monday was held after church, where daughters were presented in the town square. Parents stood with them as if at a livestock fair. One observer in the 18th century even wrote that the daughters stand like merchandise to be bartered. Imagine swiping right, except the whole town is watching and your mother is shouting about your embroidery skills. Historians still argue whether these markets were primarily practical, ensuring suitable matches in small communities, or whether they were exaggerated by moralists who wanted to shame people for treating marriage too much like trade. Perhaps both were true. You imagine the gossip. Oh, she found a husband at the Monday market, but did she find love? The setting feels oddly familiar. The hum of bargaining, the sly glances, the subtle inspections. It's a farmer's market with higher stakes. You notice the way mothers fuss with their daughters' hair, adjusting ribbons to make them seem more desirable. Fathers slap their sons on the back, urging them to stand straighter, flex their shoulders, look more competent. Every gesture is a performance. And yet amid the bargaining, little rebellions happen. A boy leans too close, whispering something that makes a girl laugh despite her mother's glare. A pair of eyes meet across the market, not through calculation, but through genuine curiosity. You sense the tension, the machinery of economics versus the sparks of human chemistry. You pause near a stall where dowries are being quietly compared. One family lists coins and cattle, another promises a cottage and tools. The words fly fast like merchants haggling over cloth. And just for a moment you wonder if the young people themselves hear any of it, or if the din of parental bargaining drowns out everything but the thump of their own nervous hearts. The irony is sharp. What was called a market was often advertised as a wholesome tradition, a way of sustaining communities. But in the quiet corners, where eyes met and hands brushed, something else pulsed beneath the surface, a faint rhythm of possibility that no dowry could price. As the crowd begins to thin and the banners sag in the evening air, you step back. The marketplace grows quieter, the chatter fades, but the memory of all those whispered bargains lingers. Courtship here was less of a stroll and more of a transaction. Yet you can't help but note, like any market, it was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes, just sometimes, a miracle deal slipped through where love got the better of the ledger. You drift out of the bustling square and into a smaller chamber where the noise fades and the atmosphere turns ceremonial. The air is thick with beeswax and lavender, and the table before you is laid not with contracts or coins, but with gifts, tokens exchanged between betrothed couples. At first glance, they look like symbols of affection, sweet little gestures, but when you lean closer, you realize they're less about sentiment and more about collateral, tiny stand-ins for much larger promises. The mainstream fact, betrothal gifts were widespread in Europe and beyond. Rings, gloves, coins, or even household goods were often exchanged before a marriage as visible signs of commitment. In many legal systems, these tokens could serve as proof of a binding engagement. If one party broke the promise, the other might sue, pointing to the gift as evidence. Imagine someone dragging you to court over the sweater you gave them at Christmas. You glance down at a gleaming ring resting on a cushion. It looks romantic, but its meaning is clear. This isn't just jewelry, it's collateral. A glove lies beside it, worn, embroidered, and oddly significant. A glove might signal the sealing of a promise, its soft fabric carrying the weight of law. And then there are coins, sometimes split in half between lovers. If one party broke faith, the mismatched halves could be brought together in court as damning proof. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, gifts weren't always practical or elegant. Records exist of young men giving apples, knives, or even spoons as engagement tokens. One court case in Germany involved a man who sued because the girl returned the spoon he had given her, thus signaling she no longer wished to marry. Historians still argue whether these odd gifts were symbolic or simply the cheapest thing a young man could find in a hurry. You picture the scene, a nervous young man fumbling with a coin in his palm. He presses it into his sweetheart's hand, whispering, "This binds us." She blushes, but her mother nods approvingly, satisfied that the gesture strengthens the family's bargaining position. The boy may think he has offered romance. The adults see only evidence, leverage, insurance. And yet these gifts sometimes carried genuine warmth. A ribbon tied carefully around a glove, a coin polished until it gleamed, a ring slipped onto a finger with trembling hands. These moments must have stirred something tender. You can almost feel the flutter of excitement as a girl hides her token in a chest, lifting it out at night to smile secretly in the candlelight. But the system was unforgiving. A gift accepted was a contract sealed. If a girl later broke the engagement, she might be accused of dishonor, or even sued for damages. If a boy reneged, he risked losing face, money, or the trust of his community. It's hard not to laugh at the image, a courtroom solemnly debating whether a half-eaten apple still counts as binding evidence. You step back from the table, watching the gifts shimmer in the flickering light. Rings, gloves, coins, each small, each portable, each heavy with meaning. They remind you of how fragile courtship was, how every gesture doubled as both affection and obligation. You realize that in this world, even love had receipts. As you leave the chamber, you carry the echo of these little tokens with you. They seem innocent, but in truth, they were the hinges on which entire futures swung. One misplaced glove, one disputed coin, one broken ribbon could unravel alliances, tarnish reputations, and cost families dearly. The gifts were small, but their shadows stretched long. You step out of the chamber of gifts and into a stone-walled church, its interior cool and echoing with the scent of incense. Sunlight filters through narrow stained glass windows, painting the floor with fractured colors. The hush here feels different. Not the tense quiet of bargaining, but the solemn weight of authority. You realize you've entered the space where every whispered promise, every dowry, every gift ultimately had to be sanctioned. The church. The mainstream fact is unavoidable. In medieval and early modern Europe, the church wasn't just a spiritual overseer of marriage. It was also the registrar, the legal anchor. Priests recorded unions, validated vows, and sometimes acted as mediators in disputes. Without the church's acknowledgement, a marriage was shaky at best, void at worst. You pause near the altar where a priest stands, his voice steady as he recites the marriage liturgy. The couple kneels, their families arrayed behind them like witnesses in a trial. The ritual feels less like a private vow of affection and more like a public declaration to God, the community, and the law simultaneously. The candles flicker, and you realize this was binding in every possible sense: spiritual, social, financial. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, couples could marry simply by exchanging vows in front of witnesses without a priest present. These so-called clandestine marriages drove church authorities mad because they bypassed oversight. Lovers meeting under a tree might technically be wed, much to their parents' horror. Historians still argue whether the church tolerated this as inevitable or cracked down out of fear of losing control. You imagine one such secret ceremony. A boy and girl clasping hands under the branches of an oak, murmuring vows with only the stars as witnesses. To them, it's romantic and defiant. To their families, it's chaos. To the church, it's a loophole threatening the entire system of contracts and records. And so councils debated endlessly how much authority should rest on a priest's blessing, how much on the couple's words. Back inside the church, the role of record keeper becomes clear. Parish registers were meticulously kept, noting names, dates, dowries, and settlements. These weren't just love stories, they were community ledgers. You can almost see the priest's quill scratching, his book heavy with the weight of generations. Each name inscribed wasn't just a soul united in faith, it was a data point in the economy of alliances. Of course, the church also shaped the rules of marriage, dictating who could marry whom, forbidding unions within certain degrees of kinship, and banning remarriage for some. You picture a young couple told they can't wed because they're fourth cousins. The frustration simmers. The priest insists. The law of God forbids it. Meanwhile, their parents grumble, calculating the wasted negotiations. The tension between personal will and institutional authority lingers here. The church gave marriages legitimacy, but it also limited choices. You imagine sitting in the pews as the priest declares certain unions invalid, certain matches sinful, certain vows binding forever. The power is immense. You'd think twice before whispering anything that might sound like a promise. And yet, the church wasn't immune to satire. Playwrights mocked priests who were too eager to collect fees, or couples who manipulated the rules to their advantage. The image of a priest nodding gravely while pocketing coins is a familiar caricature in ballads and stories. Even here, in sacred space, the sarcasm of human nature seeped through. As you step out of the church, the bells toll, echoing over rooftops. They sound celebratory, but to your ears they carry another note, a reminder that every marriage was more than love, more than family. It was paperwork, surveillance, regulation, and divine stamp of approval, all bound together in one solemn ring of bronze. You walk back into the sunlight, feeling the weight of those tolling bells in your chest. Behind every peal is another ledger entry, another contract sealed, another set of lives knotted into the church's vast account book. You leave the echo of the church bells behind and find yourself in a quieter study, the air sharp with the smell of parchment and sealing wax. The shelves sag with volumes of statutes, and on the heavy oak desk lies a contract spread wide, a marriage settlement drafted in the careful hand of a lawyer. You've wandered into the world where romance and law intertwine so closely, it feels less like poetry and more like a business merger. The mainstream fact here: by the 17th century, particularly among the landed and wealthy classes, lawyers were deeply involved in drafting marriage settlements. These agreements detailed dowries, jointures, property transfers, and inheritance rights, often in language that resembled corporate contracts more than declarations of love. Without these papers, a marriage was risky business. You lean over the document, eyes tracing lines that read more like a deed than a promise. Upon the solemnization of this marriage, the lands adjoining the north field shall pass to the husband, his heirs, and assigns, provided the sum of £200 be delivered by the bride's family. You exhale softly. Not exactly the sonnet Shakespeare might have penned. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some contracts even specified furniture, livestock, or household goods in excruciating detail. There's a surviving settlement from 18th century England listing 1 feather bed, 6 pewter plates, 1 brass pot, and 2 cows in good condition. Imagine bringing that to a notary today. I, being of sound mind, leave my love and also 1 brass pot. Historians still argue whether these settlements gave women more security or stripped them of agency entirely. On one hand, jointures ensured widows weren't left destitute. On the other, they often limited what women could do with their property, binding them to male relatives' decisions. Was it protection or just another leash? The debate lingers like dust on these parchments. You picture a lawyer, wig slightly askew, dipping his quill and droning through the clauses while the bride and groom sit stiffly at the table. She fiddles nervously with her gloves, he stares at the ink pot, and the parents nod approvingly as if they're finalizing a deal for wool shipments. A clerk in the corner scratches out duplicate copies, his face as blank as the page he's filling. And yet, for all its dryness, the settlement was theatre too. The ceremony of sealing, the splash of wax, the press of signet rings, all lent an air of ritual to the transaction. You imagine the moment of silence as the last signature is scrawled, the wax hardens, and the contract is folded into a chest. The young couple might exchange a glance, half relief, half dread, knowing their fates have just been inked permanently. Sometimes, though, the language of law left room for loopholes. Clever lawyers built clauses to protect hidden assets, to bypass taxes, to preserve property in case of scandal. You smirk, realizing prenups and clever evasions aren't modern inventions at all. They've been around as long as ink and ambition. The scene shifts in your mind to a candlelit hall where families gather after signing. The contract lies folded, guarded like treasure. The fathers shake hands, the mothers sip spiced wine, and the couple sits quietly, barely speaking. Everyone congratulates themselves on the success of the merger. No one mentions the missing spark, the silence between the newly bound. You step back from the study, the faint scratch of quills fading behind you. The image clings, romance distilled into parchment, sealed with wax, overseen by men in wigs. You realize you've just witnessed the legal spine of marriage's business, a skeleton that propped up the entire structure, whether the heart wanted it or not. And so you drift onward, past shelves, sagging with contracts, past chests, heavy with sealed documents. In this world, love is fragile, but the law is permanent. You step away from the lawyer's study, the smell of sealing wax still clinging to you, and drift into a drafty hall where a family ledger lies open on the table. The ink is neat, the columns precise, and between the entries for wool bales and cattle, another line is carefully inscribed: marriage portion for Anne, valued at £400. Here you can see how the cold arithmetic of inheritance shaped courtship, turning sons and daughters into chess pieces in the game of succession. The mainstream fact is stark. Inheritance laws determined far more about whom one could marry than love ever did. In many European regions, the practice of primogeniture meant that the eldest son inherited nearly everything, while younger siblings had to scramble for advantageous marriages or church positions. For daughters, the size of the dowry directly influenced whether they'd be matched respectably or left unmarried altogether. You trace your fingers along the ledger and picture the family debates. A father weighing his resources, deciding which daughter to endow most richly. A younger son fuming that his elder brother will get the estate while he's left chasing a widow with decent property. Marriage, in this light, looks less like a choice and more like a survival strategy for managing generational wealth. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some families got so anxious about inheritance that they arranged cousin marriages just to keep land within the clan. The family tree became more of a tangled hedge. One infamous case in Renaissance Spain involved so many intermarriages that contemporaries joked the family crest should be replaced with a corkscrew. Historians still argue whether these inheritance-driven strategies secured stability or sowed long-term disaster. Did concentrating land in fewer hands preserve dynasties, or did it breed bitter rivalries and lawsuits? You can almost hear the ancestors bickering through the pages. One insists it's prudent consolidation, another mutters, it's a recipe for family feuds. You imagine a girl, maybe 17, being told she'll marry a man twice her age because his estate borders theirs and the merger prevents land from fragmenting. Her diary, if she dares to write one, might have lines of melancholy, dreams of another boy now forever unreachable. Yet her father insists, better one large farm than two broken ones. For sons, the pressure was just as fierce. The heir might marry to solidify alliances, but his younger brothers were often pawns, married off to heiresses for their fortunes or pushed into the clergy. You picture a bitter second son muttering through gritted teeth at his wedding, knowing full well he's been chosen not for his charm, but for the cash he brings home. And still, inheritance law had loopholes. Some fathers used wills to favour daughters, bypassing tradition, sparking outrage among sons. Others split estates evenly, sowing rivalries as fields were divided into useless strips. The courtroom battles that followed became spectacles of their own, where siblings clawed over grain stores and vineyards like hawks over prey. You smirk at one documented case. In 17th century France, a family fought for years over whether a dowry should include 2 cows or 2 cows and their calves. The court records read less like legal proceedings and more like petty squabbles in a barnyard. The atmosphere in the hall grows heavy. The ledger pages turn, and each line binds another life to the cold arithmetic of land and money. You realize that here, love wasn't just secondary, it was irrelevant. What mattered was who would plough the fields, who would inherit the orchard, who would keep the family name alive in stone and soil. As you close the ledger and step back into the night, the image of those inked columns lingers. Each number is a chain, each entry a choice already made. Inheritance didn't just shape families, it dictated futures, crushing affection under the weight of property law. You slip away from the hall of ledgers and into a storeroom that smells faintly of hay, tallow, and damp stone. Here, beneath the flickering lamplight, you notice wooden chests stacked against the wall. Some contain bolts of cloth, others silverware, and one even holds account books scrawled with more than just numbers. You flip a page, and there it is, a daughter's name written alongside cattle and acreage. The language makes it plain: women themselves were logged as assets. The mainstream fact is this: in many societies from medieval Europe to Qing dynasty China, daughters were often described in transactional terms, their value calculated through dowries or bride prices. They were not just part of the family, they were part of the ledger, measured like land or livestock. You picture a father dictating to his steward 2 cows, 1 meadow, and a daughter of marriageable age. It sounds absurd to your ears, but in his world, the daughter represents both risk and reward. Risk because she must be placed without scandal. Reward because her union can strengthen alliances or bring wealth. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some manorial roles, daughters were literally listed alongside horses and oxen under movable property. One clerk even joked in the margin, "This one does not plough but may bear fruit." You can almost hear the sarcastic snort through the centuries. Historians still argue whether this language was meant literally as cold inventory or metaphorically, reflecting how economic logic infected every corner of life. You glance around and imagine a girl overhearing her worth being debated. She hears her father say, "She's comely, yes, but more importantly, she brings 50 acres through her mother's dowry." To the girl, it stings. To the father, it's business. Affection rarely enters the equation. Sometimes the description went further. Skills, health, and chastity all tallied. A daughter who could spin, embroider, or manage a household was a better investment. A scandal, a rumoured indiscretion, or even an illness could slash her market value. You wince at the bluntness, but recognize the echoes in modern society, where resumes and reputations still weigh heavily in how people are judged. You picture a mother trying to soften the harshness, slipping extra linens into the dowry chest, carefully embroidering initials onto napkins, hoping the gesture will make her daughter more appealing. It's an act of care, but also complicity, wrapping love in the logic of assets. And yet within this framework, small rebellions existed. Daughters who resisted unwanted matches, mothers who argued fiercely for better terms, even clerks who scribbled sly jokes in margins. These were cracks in the facade. Perhaps the cold ink on the page didn't always capture the warmth of lived lives. Still the image lingers, a young woman reduced to a line in a ledger, her fate negotiated with the same seriousness as cattle breeding. You imagine her stepping outside, staring at the moon, and wondering if anyone will ever see her as more than an entry under assets. As you leave the storeroom, the chests creak shut behind you, their contents hidden once more. The night air feels fresher, but the weight of those ledgers clings to your shoulders. In this world, women were valued, yes, but often not as people. They were collateral in a contract, assets to be moved, traded, and secured. You walk away from the storeroom of ledgers and chests and into the chill of an empty lane. The silence feels sharper now, broken only by the echo of your own steps on cobblestones. And then just ahead, you catch the flicker of lantern light, the hurried shuffle of boots, and the rush of hushed voices. You've stumbled upon an escape, not the kind involving prisoners, but couples. Lovers slipping away from the weight of family contracts, chasing freedom through elopement. The mainstream fact, elopements were common enough that entire legal frameworks sprang up to deal with them. In England, places like Gretna Green, just over the Scottish border, became famous because couples could wed quickly, without parental consent. Across Europe and even the American colonies, eloping was the ultimate loophole, a way to hack the system of dowries, ledgers, and parental negotiations. You linger in the shadows and watch a girl climb into a waiting cart. She clutches her cloak tight, her cheeks flushed with fear and thrill. Beside her, the young man grips the reins, urging the horse forward. The wheels rattle, the lantern swings, and within minutes they vanish down the road. To their families, this is a scandal. To them, it's salvation. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some inns along the Gretna Green route were notorious for staging hasty ceremonies. A blacksmith might preside, hammering on an anvil to symbolize the forging of new bonds. Imagine it. No priest, no ornate church, just a clang of iron and the smell of horse sweat. Historians still argue whether these blacksmith weddings were solemn enough to count or merely tolerated out of convenience. But elopements carried risk. Families could send pursuers, angry fathers, hired riders, even constables to drag couples back. You picture a breathless chase, wheels spinning, hooves pounding, until the couple crosses into a jurisdiction where parental permission no longer matters. The relief is immense, but so is the cost. Broken ties, lost inheritances, reputations shredded like parchment in the rain. And yet you can't help but admire the defiance. In a world where every glance and gift was monitored, where contracts outweighed emotions, these runaways dared to put affection above accounts. They risked survival for something as fragile as love. Imagine a boy writing a frantic note. "Meet me by the bridge at midnight. Bring nothing but your courage." She obeys, her hands trembling as she slips out the door, knowing she might never see her family again. The road is cold, the journey uncertain, but in her heart flickers a warmth stronger than dowries and ledgers. Of course, not all elopements ended well. Some couples returned, shamed and penniless, their rebellion crushed. Others thrived, carving new lives in distant towns. And occasionally, parents relented, realizing too late that love was harder to stamp out than they believed. You smirk at the irony. In trying to control every step of courtship, families created the very pressure that drove young people to rebellion. The more the leash tightened, the more enticing the loophole became. As the lantern light fades, you step back into the silence of the lane. The air is cold, but the memory of that cart racing into the night lingers, an image of love sprinting just ahead of duty, passion thundering against the heavy hooves of tradition. The night air feels different now, charged with the memory of hooves pounding and lanterns swinging. You walk further, and suddenly the narrow lanes widen into a grand courtyard, lit by torches and glittering chandeliers beyond. Guards in livery stand at attention, and banners hang heavy with coats of arms. Here you are no longer among farmers and merchants. You've stepped into the rarefied world of royal marriage, where every union redraws maps and treaties, where a kiss at the altar might shift the fate of nations. The mainstream fact is clear. For monarchs and noble dynasties, marriage was never primarily about love. It was about politics. Think of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, whose 1469 union literally forged modern Spain, or the countless Habsburg alliances that created a sprawling empire stitched together less by battles than by wedding rings. Diplomats quipped, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." You watch as a young princess is led into the hall, her gown a cascade of brocade, her eyes wary. She's perhaps 14, her hand trembling as it's placed into that of a man twice her age. Around them, courtiers nod approvingly. This isn't romance. It's geopolitics with pearls. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some royal marriages were negotiated so meticulously that entire lists of physical attributes were exchanged like livestock evaluations. A king's envoy might write, "The princess has strong teeth, fair skin, and is of modest temperament." Imagine sliding a medical report across a gilded table and calling it love. Historians still argue whether these descriptions reflected genuine concern for heirs or were simply excuses to reject less appealing matches. And sometimes the spectacle bordered on absurd. One story tells of a prince who sent an artist to paint his prospective bride before meeting her. When the painting arrived, she looked lovely. But when he finally saw her in person, he complained the artist had been far too generous. You imagine the painter shrugging, muttering, "What? I just added some flattering lighting." You drift closer to the throne where contracts are read aloud in front of ambassadors. Territories are promised, dowries measured not in linens or cows but in castles, armies, and trade routes. The young couple barely exchange glances, for they know their marriage is less a vow than a treaty sealed with rings instead of wax. Yet even here, sparks of humanity flicker. You picture Catherine of Aragon, shipped from Spain to England as a teenager, married off to Prince Arthur, then later Henry VIII. Did she ever feel love? Did she dare? Or was she, like so many princesses, a vessel for dynastic ambition, her heart secondary to her womb? In the background, courtiers whisper, "If this union holds, there will be peace. If it breaks, there will be war." The stakes are astronomical, thrones gained, borders lost, alliances fractured. You realize you are standing in a marriage market not for cows and coins, but for kingdoms. And yet, you smirk at the absurd parallels to modern times. Swipe right, and you get dinner. Swipe wrong here, and you plunge a continent into 30 years of war. No pressure. The trumpets blare, the vows are spoken, the hall erupts in applause. But as you step back, you notice the girl's eyes, downcast, resigned. The groom raises her hand triumphantly like a general holding a captured banner. The crowd cheers, treaties are toasted, and two people who barely know each other walk off toward a future where their personal happiness means almost nothing compared to the empire's gain. As the torches flicker against stone walls, you realize royal marriage was the grandest contract of all, a merger so monumental that even love itself was too small to matter. You leave behind the glittering chandeliers of the royal court and wander across the sea, where the night air smells of wood smoke, pine, and salt. The cobblestones give way to muddy tracks and timber houses loom instead of castles. Here, the business of marriage is less about treaties and dynasties and more about bare survival. You've arrived in the colonies where settlers carved homes out of wilderness and learned that courtship itself could be a bargain struck for endurance. The mainstream fact in early colonial America, especially in places like Jamestown or Plymouth, marriages were encouraged not only for personal stability, but also for the stability of the entire settlement. Colonial leaders believed that family units were the foundation of order and productivity. A married couple meant children, and children meant more hands to farm, cook, and defend the community. You watch a young woman step off a creaking ship, her bundle small, her face pale with exhaustion. Around her, men murmur, not about her beauty, but about her usefulness. Can she sew? Can she cook? Does she have linens, or at least a cow promised in dowry? To them, she's less a romantic prospect and more a lifeline in the fragile web of colonial survival. Here's your quirky tidbit. In 1620s Virginia, the Virginia Company actually shipped tobacco brides. Women sent from England to marry colonists in exchange for £150 of tobacco each, which the men paid as their bride price. Imagine your worth being measured in dried leaves, stuffed in barrels. Historians still argue whether these women came willingly in search of opportunity, or whether they were coerced by poverty and family pressure back home. You follow one such pairing, a farmer with calloused hands negotiating with a newly arrived girl's guardian. "I have a cabin and 2 cleared acres," he offers. "I can promise winter stores." The girl listens silently, her future sealed not by affection, but by the number of logs stacked against his wall. She accepts because what choice does she have? To refuse might mean destitution in an unfamiliar land. But even in these raw conditions, moments of affection flickered. You imagine a boy carving initials into a tree, a girl saving scraps of ribbon to tie in her hair, a couple laughing quietly by the fire after a long day of toil. Love didn't vanish. It just had to squeeze itself between barter and necessity. The risks were immense. A poor match could mean starvation, especially in harsh winters. Marrying into a family with no food stores or weak defenses could literally kill you. Courtship here was as pragmatic as choosing the right axe. You wanted one that wouldn't break when the storm hit. And yet the settlers themselves often dressed this up in language of faith. Preachers exhorted couples to unite as a way of strengthening God's outpost in the wilderness. A marriage wasn't just a personal matter, it was a holy duty to the colony. In a way, it turned every wedding into both a sacrament and a survival strategy. You smirk at the odd comparison. While kings traded princesses for castles, colonists traded brides for barrels of tobacco. 2 extremes, but both steeped in contracts that mattered more than feelings. As you walk past the cabins, smoke rising against the starlit sky, you notice the muffled sounds of laughter, of children playing, of fires crackling. Despite the harshness, despite the transactional beginnings, life pushes forward. Families form, children are born, fields are ploughed. The colony survives, not because love was prioritized, but because marriage, in whatever form it took, was business, contract, and community survival rolled into one. You leave behind the raw frontier cabins and follow the scent of spiced wine drifting from a city street where houses lean close together, their windows glowing. The scene feels more secure than the wilderness, but the air still buzzes with negotiation. You realize you've stepped into the world of widows, women who had already played the marriage game once and were now back at the table, often with more leverage than before. The mainstream fact in early modern Europe and colonial America, widows held unusual power in marriage negotiations. Unlike unmarried daughters, they could inherit property, control dowries, and sometimes even run businesses. Remarriage wasn't just expected, it was often strategic, a way to redistribute wealth and consolidate alliances all over again. You step into a parlor where a widow in her 40s sits upright in a high-backed chair, her black gown edged in lace. Before her, 2 men discuss her prospects, not in whispers, but openly. Her late husband's estate includes 3 warehouses by the river, one says. Any union with her secures those leases. The other strokes his beard thoughtfully, calculating. Meanwhile, the widow herself smiles faintly, fully aware that her value has shifted. She is no longer an asset handed over by her father. She is the asset. Here's your quirky tidbit. In parts of Renaissance Italy, widows were so influential that some cities passed laws limiting their remarriage, fearing that too much property would concentrate in a handful of families through repeated unions. Historians still argue whether this was genuine concern for balance or just another attempt to restrain women who had finally gained economic power. You imagine one of these widows strolling through a marketplace, head held high. Young wives lower their eyes respectfully. Men bow a little too deeply. Everyone knows she controls money, land, and servants. Suitors hover like bees, not just for her smile, but for the keys jangling at her waist. Some widows resisted remarriage, preferring independence. You picture a woman managing her vineyard alone, her ledger neat, her accounts balanced, her children provided for. She may miss companionship, but she savors freedom, the ability to make choices without a father or husband dictating terms. Others, however, saw remarriage as a chance to climb further up the ladder. A carefully chosen second husband could double their fortune or align them with more powerful allies. And then there were the whispers of scandal. A widow who remarried too quickly might be accused of greed, even infidelity. You smirk at the double standard. A man remarrying was practical. A woman doing the same was suspicious. Pamphleteers even mocked wealthy widows as black-clad spiders, luring new husbands into their webs. The caricature lingers, half humorous, half cruel. But if you lean closer, you hear the personal stories hidden under the contracts. A widow laughing with a suitor over supper, discovering companionship after years of duty. Another sitting by a fire, remembering her first husband fondly while daring to hope for tenderness the second time around. These private flickers remind you that even in a world ruled by ledgers, affection still found room to breathe. As you step back into the lamplit street, you notice widows everywhere, in doorways, in markets, in parish pews, each one negotiating her position in a society that suddenly treated her with both suspicion and respect. Unlike daughters, they weren't pawns. They were players in their own right, reshaping the game of contracts with every remarriage. The air feels charged, almost defiant, as if these women had carved a narrow but powerful path through the iron cage of custom. And you realize, for all the talk of courtship as business, widows proved that sometimes the negotiator holding the pen wasn't a father or husband at all, it was the woman herself. The lamps of the widow's street fade behind you, and the night carries you into a quieter lane where the air smells of baked bread and damp stone. For the first time in what feels like ages, you sense something softer, a warmth slipping through the cracks of calculation. Here, among all the contracts and coins, romance itself sneaks in, sometimes against the odds, sometimes under disguise, but always stubbornly present. The mainstream fact, even in societies where marriages were negotiated like treaties, we still find records of couples who genuinely fell in love. Letters survive in which partners write not of dowries, but of longing. Poems celebrate affection that grew despite arranged beginnings. Historians point to figures like Petrarch, who wrote passionately to Laura, or to humble parish records noting couples fined for kissing in public. The spark was never fully extinguished. You step into a bakery where a young apprentice slides loaves from an oven. His hands are flour-dusted, his hair damp with sweat. At the counter, a girl lingers longer than she needs to, paying for bread she could easily have fetched in a minute. Their eyes meet, they laugh quietly, and for a moment there's no ledger, no dowry, no chaperone, just two people stealing a spark amid the grind of duty. Here's your quirky tidbit. In 17th century France, love tokens weren't always rings or gloves. Sometimes couples carved initials into bread crusts and exchanged them secretly. Romantic? Yes. Durable? Not really, unless you ate it fast. Historians still argue whether such gestures were tolerated by parents as harmless or condemned as dangerous flirtations. You follow another scene, a husband and wife sitting by their hearth, married originally for dowry and land. Years have passed, and affection has quietly taken root. He watches her mend a shirt. She laughs at his clumsy attempt to stir the pot, and in these small domestic rhythms, something tender has grown. It wasn't passion at first sight, but companionship forged slowly, like bread rising by the fire. and sometimes affection sparked rebellion. Think of Romeo and Juliet, not fictional in spirit, but drawn from countless real families who battled over love that refused to follow the rules. Lovers risked disgrace, exile, even death, because the pull of affection proved stronger than contracts. The tragedy resonates precisely because audiences recognized the tension. They lived it too. You pause by a garden wall where two shadows lean close. The boy whispers through the lattice. The girl giggles softly, and above them the moon watches silently. Tomorrow her parents will resume negotiations, but tonight she lets herself believe that love might still matter. You smirk at how familiar this feels. Replace the wall with a smartphone screen, and you'd have two teenagers texting under the covers, hearts racing with the same thrill of secrecy. Centuries apart, but the pulse is identical. Still, the risks were real. A discovered letter could be damning, a stolen kiss disastrous. But the persistence of romance reminds you of an inconvenient truth. No matter how carefully society tried to package courtship as a business deal, the human heart refused to stay balanced in the ledger. As you leave the lane, the faint smell of bread follows you, mingling with laughter that lingers in the dark. You realize that even in the most contractual of ages, love slipped through the cracks like warm light under a door. And once it crept in, it was almost impossible to push out again. The scent of bread fades, replaced by the raucous laughter of a tavern just ahead. You push open the heavy oak door and step into a haze of pipe smoke and spilled ale. The air buzzes with energy, not the stiff negotiations of ledgers and lawyers, but the sharp bite of satire. Here, playwrights and pamphleteers tear into the absurdity of marriage's contract, mocking it so mercilessly that even the most solemn matchmaker might blush. The mainstream fact, theatre of the 17th and 18th centuries, frequently lampooned the transactional nature of courtship. In England, writers like William Congreve and Richard Sheridan filled stages with conniving fathers, greedy suitors, and daughters who outwitted them all. Across Europe, Molière skewered hypocritical guardians and pompous husbands. The audience roared because they recognized their own families on stage. You slide onto a bench near the back, mug of ale in hand, and watch the performance. A pompous old man struts across the boards declaring, "My daughter shall marry the merchant with 3 ships, not the fool who only brings her flowers." The audience howls with laughter. The actor's wig wobbles dangerously, his voice shrill with greed. It's exaggerated, yes, but you know it's also uncomfortably true. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some satirical plays were so biting that real families recognized themselves in the caricatures. Lawsuits followed, accusing playwrights of defamation. Imagine storming into a theatre yelling, "That greedy buffoon was clearly me." Historians still argue whether satire merely entertained or actively pressured society to rethink its obsession with dowries and contracts. The play continues. A clever daughter tricks her father by disguising her true love as a wealthy nobleman, only for the reveal at the wedding to spark chaos. The audience claps, whistles, stomps their feet. They cheer not just for comedy, but for the fantasy that wit and affection could win over greed. Pamphlets joined the chorus, their crude cartoons plastered in markets. One broadside shows a bride weighed on a scale, her dowry piled high on the other side, while a groom rubs his hands with glee. Another depicts a lawyer drafting contracts while Cupid naps in the corner, neglected and ignored. The humour stings, but that sting was the point. You sip your ale and glance around. Merchants, farmers, apprentices, all laugh together, the tavern echoing with mirth. But beneath the laughter lies something sharper, the recognition that their own marriages, their own daughters, their own negotiations look uncomfortably similar to the caricatures. Even ballads sung in the streets joined in the mockery. A singer, strums his lute, belting verses about a miserly father selling his daughter for a cow. Children giggle, adults shake their heads, and you sense the satire works as both entertainment and critique, and yet you can't help but notice how satire also gave young people a voice. In plays, clever heroines often triumphed, tricking their greedy guardians and marrying for love. On the stage, at least, affection could win. Whether audiences left inspired or resigned is harder to say, but for a few hours the dream flickered brightly under the tavern's smoky rafters. As the play ends and the crowd spills into the night, the laughter lingers in the cool air. You realize satire did what contracts and chaperones could not. It exposed the absurdity of reducing love to a business deal. It didn't dismantle the system, but it reminded everyone that beneath the ledgers, hearts still beat, and hearts often preferred comedy to contracts. The tavern crowd disperses into the chilly night, their laughter still echoing against the cobblestones. You follow the sound of bells in the distance until you reach the edge of a churchyard, where a small group has gathered. Lanterns sway, hymnals rustle, and a preacher's voice cuts through the night with urgency. You realize you've stumbled into the domain of religious resistance, the fiery sermons and pamphlets that railed against marriage as mere transaction, calling for something higher, something holier. The mainstream fact, the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, radically reshaped how people thought about marriage. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin rejected the idea that marriage was a sacrament controlled exclusively by the Catholic Church. Instead, they insisted it was a covenant before God, meant to be lived out in daily faith and companionship. This theological shift opened debates about love, equality, and responsibility within marriage, though practice often lagged behind the preaching. You linger as the preacher's words ring out. Marriage is not the buying and selling of daughters. It is not cattle traded for coin. It is a union sanctified by God himself, and no ledger can capture its worth. The crowd murmurs, some nodding, others glancing uneasily at one another. You can feel the tension. Fathers gripping their daughters' hands a little tighter, mothers pursing their lips, young couples daring to hope. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some radical sects in the 17th century even argued that arranged marriages were sinful. A few communities experimented with more egalitarian approaches, allowing women greater say in choosing husbands. Of course, their critics labelled them dangerous heretics, accusing them of promoting immorality. Historians still argue whether these movements truly liberated women or merely replaced one form of control with another under different rhetoric. You picture a young man scribbling furiously in the margin of his Bible, "I shall not marry for dowry but for devotion." He folds the page, hoping one day to slip it to the girl he admires. In his heart, faith fuels affection, even as his parents whisper of alliances and estates. The resistance wasn't only Protestant. Catholic reformers, too, condemned the greed infecting marriages. Priests thundered from pulpits against fathers who treated daughters like property, insisting that true marriage required mutual consent. The irony, of course, is that these same priests often enforced strict rules that left little room for rebellion. Still, the rhetoric mattered. It planted seeds of doubt in a system long treated as inevitable. And then there were the poets cloaked in piety. They wrote hymns that compared love between husband and wife to Christ's devotion to the church, lofty, tender, uncompromising. You imagine these verses sung softly in kitchens, carried on the wind through village streets, reminding even the most practical households that maybe, just maybe, love was more than a bargaining chip. Yet resistance always provoked backlash. Satirical pamphlets mocked preachers for being naive idealists. "What good is a holy covenant if the farm lies fallow?" one critic wrote. "Love cannot milk a cow." You smirk at the blunt practicality, but you sensed the real fear, that romance would disrupt the carefully balanced system of inheritance and alliance. Still, the sermons carried weight. Couples began to argue for the right to choose their partners. Parents, once absolute in their control, occasionally conceded. The cracks in the edifice widened, not from rebellion alone, but from the pulpit itself. As the preacher closes his Bible and the lanterns dim, you step back into the night, the air alive with echoes of his words. You realize that religion, so often the enforcer of marriage contracts, also became one of the first to challenge them. And in that paradox, the story of courtship grew even more tangled. Part business, part faith, part defiance. The preacher's lanterns fade behind you, and soon the street grows broader, lined with tall houses whose windows gleam like watchful eyes. You pause at the corner, where the chatter of a marketplace still lingers, only this time the tone is sharper, more brittle. You've wandered into the realm of class tensions, where the rules of courtship shift, depending on whether you're a noble sipping wine in a gilded hall, or a farmhand wiping sweat from your brow in the fields. The mainstream fact, courtship played out very differently across social classes. Among nobles and wealthy merchants, marriages were grand strategies for preserving or expanding estates. Among peasants, they were often practical bargains, more about labor and survival than dowries and treaties. But in both cases, business overshadowed affection. The differences lay mainly in scale. You step into a manor hall first. The air is heavy with perfume and candle smoke, the chatter punctuated by clinking goblets. A nobleman declares, "Our son will marry into the Montfort family, for they have 20,000 acres." The daughter in question sits silently, jewels glittering in her hair, her role as passive as the candelabra beside her. Here, love is an afterthought if it's thought of at all. And yet nobles had their indulgences. You recall stories of clandestine affairs, mistresses tucked away in country houses, poets whispering verses at midnight. Passion existed, but rarely in the marriage bed. The contract-bound estates, the heart wandered elsewhere. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, peasants actually had more freedom to marry for affection than nobles. Records from alpine villages show couples negotiating modest dowries themselves, sometimes even defying parents outright. Historians still argue whether this was true freedom or simply a necessity in communities too small for rigid contracts. After all, if there are only 3 eligible bachelors in town, your choices are limited, but at least they're yours. You step out of the manor and wander into a farmhouse. The smell of stew hangs in the air, and 2 families sit around a rough wooden table. "Our son can split wood and mend roofs," one father boasts. "Our daughter spins wool and keeps house well," replies the other. The couple glance at each other, shy but hopeful. No pearls, no titles, but the same negotiations play out, scaled down from castles to cottages. And then there are the in-betweeners, shopkeepers, artisans, apprentices. For them, the line between affection and contract blurred daily. A shoemaker's daughter might insist on marrying the boy she loves, but if his wages couldn't sustain her, her parents would balk. Love might win in the end, but only if it could balance the books. You imagine a blacksmith's son leaning against a forge, wiping sweat from his brow, telling a girl, "I've no estate, but my arms are strong." She smiles, thinking not of castles, but of survival, children, and warmth by the fire. Their marriage may lack grandeur, but it has its own kind of strength. And yet, the classes judged each other mercilessly. Nobles scoffed at peasant marriages, calling them crude. Peasants mocked nobles for their cold, loveless unions. Satire and gossip flew both ways, each group convinced the other misunderstood what marriage truly was. As you move back into the street, the contrast lingers. On one side, gilded halls where daughters are chess pieces in dynastic games. On the other, cottages where love has a fighting chance, though always shadowed by poverty. Both worlds spin on the same axis, marriage as contract. But the balance between affection and survival tilts differently depending on how heavy your purse is. You walk on, the glow of mansions and the dim flicker of cottages blending into one strange, uneven light, illuminating the same truth. Whether noble or peasant, courtship was never far from business. The uneven glow of cottages and mansions fades as you drift toward a harbour, where the air smells of tar, fish, and salt. Ships creak in their moorings, sails flap in the breeze, and you can hear voices in half a dozen languages mingling on the dock. Here, courtship stretches far beyond parish boundaries. It becomes a transnational contract, with families striking bargains across seas and borders. The mainstream fact: long-distance marriages were a staple of diplomacy and commerce from the Middle Ages onward. Merchant families in Venice might negotiate with partners in Constantinople, English nobles with Dutch traders, Spanish grandees with Portuguese allies. These unions stitched together not just people, but trade routes, military pacts, and cultural exchanges. You stand by a ledger on the dockmaster's table, where names are scrawled alongside goods, barrels of wine, bolts of silk, crates of spices, and beneath them notes like marriage proposed between Giovanni di Rossi and Isabel de Alarcon to secure shipment rights. It looks more like a shipping manifest than a love story. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some families relied on portraits to broker these long-distance unions. Painters were dispatched to capture a young woman's likeness, which would then be shipped across Europe as a kind of 2D Tinder profile. One unlucky groom complained that his bride looked nothing like her flattering portrait, muttering that the artist had been too generous with both light and virtue. Historians still argue whether these portraits were honest approximations or deliberate airbrushing centuries before Photoshop. You imagine the voyage of one such portrait, packed in straw, carried by mule, shipped across the sea, unwrapped in a candlelit chamber, where a nervous father squints and declares, "Yes, she'll do." Meanwhile, the girl in question sits hundreds of miles away with no idea her future has just been decided by brushstrokes. These marriages weren't just for nobles. Merchant dynasties in places like Amsterdam or Antwerp used cross-border unions to expand their networks. A son marrying into a Portuguese family might gain access to sugar imports. A daughter married into an English house might secure wool contracts. Love was optional. Profit was essential. And yet the distance bred both longing and deception. Letters travelled slowly, carried by ships vulnerable to storms and pirates. A girl might wait months for a reply, reading each word 100 times, hoping the inked promises were genuine. A boy might pen a sonnet by candlelight, only for it to arrive after she was already betrothed elsewhere. The risks were high. Ships sank, letters were lost, fortunes collapsed. Entire engagements dissolved in the space between ports. Parents cursed the sea, while poets wrote of love drowned beneath the waves. You step into a counting house where a clerk tallies a dowry sent across borders, chests of coins, silks, a cask of olive oil. It's staggering to think of marriage reduced to cargo, yet you realize it was often the safest way to transport wealth, packaged as matrimony. And still, affection sometimes bloomed. You picture two young people meeting for the first time on a wedding day after years of correspondence through letters. She recognizes his phrasing, he recognizes her hand, and for a moment the business-like union softens into something tender. Against all odds, the ink and distance had built something real. As you leave the harbour, gulls wheel overhead, their cries sharp against the wind. The sea stretches vast and dark, its waves carrying both fortunes and futures. You realize that here, more than anywhere else, marriage was a contract, written not only in ink, but in salt water, fragile, risky, and endlessly unpredictable. The salty wind fades as you follow a narrow road inland, where the glow of torches leads to a magistrate's hall. The atmosphere here is heavier. Stern faces, pointed fingers, and voices raised not in celebration, but in accusation. This is where the fragile edifice of courtship as contract cracks, when promises are broken, engagements collapsed, and reputations dragged into ruin. The mainstream fact in many early modern societies, breaking a betrothal could have serious consequences. Engagements were often considered legally binding, and to withdraw without just cause might result in lawsuits, fines, or public shame. Families could claim damages for a broken promise, arguing that dowries were wasted, alliances destroyed, or reputations tarnished. You step inside the hall and see a young man standing nervously before the magistrate. The girl's family insists he wooed her with letters and gifts, only to back out when a richer match appeared. They brandish the tokens, coins, gloves, a ribbon, as evidence. He stammers, claiming he never intended marriage, just friendship. The magistrate frowns. In this world, friendship is not an acceptable excuse. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some jurisdictions actually had a legal category called breach of promise to marry, where jilted brides could sue. One famous English case in the 18th century involved a man who argued he only proposed while drunk. The court, unimpressed, ruled against him. Historians still argue whether these suits protected women or simply reinforced the idea that they were commodities whose value had been damaged. You picture the humiliation. A girl shunned by neighbors, whispers, chasing her at market. That's the one whose engagement was broken. For her, it's not just heartbreak, it's social exile, a stain on her family. Parents groan at wasted dowries, brothers bristle with anger, and fathers curse the dishonor. The punishments varied. Some men paid restitution, others were forced to publicly apologize, still others fled towns altogether. In extreme cases, duels erupted with brothers or fathers demanding satisfaction. You smirk at the irony. What began as a business contract sometimes ended with blood in the grass, all because someone dared to follow his heart elsewhere. And yet sometimes the law sided with the runaway. If a woman discovered her fiancé was cruel, deceitful, or diseased, she could appeal to the courts for release. You imagine her standing firm, declaring, "I will not bind myself to ruin." For once, her refusal carries weight. Still, the stories that capture your attention are the ones where broken contracts led not to disaster, but to reinvention. A jilted woman might retreat to a convent and find independence. A man sued for breach of promise might escape to another town, start fresh, and marry for affection at last. Even ruin had loopholes. As you step back into the cool night, the magistrate's words still echo. Promises are binding. The street feels quieter, almost oppressive, as though the entire town listens for scandal. You realize that in a world where marriage was business, betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial fraud, social treason, and moral collapse rolled into one. The torches gutter as you walk away, leaving behind the hall of accusations. In this place, broken vows were not romantic tragedies, they were lawsuits waiting to happen. The magistrate's hall fades behind you, and the night leads you toward a smaller street where laughter rings again. Though this time it isn't theatrical satire or joyous festival chatter. Instead, it's the sharp, knowing laughter of gossip. You've arrived at the corner where scandal sheets are sold, broadsides nailed to tavern doors, and rumour-mongers whisper in the shadows. Here, broken engagements and messy negotiations become fodder for public amusement, as if courtship were just another form of fraud to expose. The mainstream fact: by the 17th and 18th centuries, cheap print exploded in popularity. Pamphlets and broadsides reported on failed betrothals, scandals, and marital disputes with the same relish we see in today's tabloids. A broken promise to marry wasn't only a personal disaster, it could become a public spectacle, read aloud in taverns and mocked at markets. You lean over a stall where sheets flutter in the wind. One headline screams, "The merchant's son who fled his bride." Another boasts, "Dowry promised, but the groom never came." The crowd chuckles, shaking their heads, tutting as though reading the financial section. You can almost imagine the ink-stained printers grinning as they sold misfortune for pennies a page. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some scandal sheets even included illustrations of jilted brides and cowardly grooms, often exaggerated into comic grotesques. A man might be drawn with donkey ears, holding a bag of coins as he runs away. A woman might be sketched clutching a dowry chest, tears flowing like rivers. Historians still argue whether these caricatures were warnings meant to shame or just entertainment for bored readers hungry for gossip. You picture a tavern where one of these sheets is read aloud. The listeners roar with laughter as the tale unfolds. How a betrothal collapsed because the dowry was late, or how a bride refused to marry a man with crooked teeth despite the contract. The moral lessons are clear enough, but so is the cruelty. Real lives reduced to comic anecdotes. And it wasn't just print. Word of mouth spread faster than ink. A woman jilted in London might find her reputation ruined in neighbouring towns within days. Markets hummed with whispers. She was promised to the brewer's son, but he found a wealthier bride. The damage was lasting, as though gossip itself became a secondary court, with no appeal and no forgiveness. Occasionally, scandal backfired. A groom mocked in broadsides might sue the printer for libel, claiming the tales exaggerated his faults. One London printer was hauled before the courts for publishing a satire about a broken engagement involving a prominent alderman's daughter. You smirk at the scene, lawyers bickering over whether donkey ears in a cartoon count as defamation. And yet, there's something oddly democratic about these sheets. For once, noble and common alike could be lampooned. A duke's scandal might sit on the same page as a milkmaid's. Courtship, so often cloaked in secrecy, was dragged into public view, exposed as the messy, human, business-riddled thing it was. As you walk away from the stall, the laughter still rings in your ears. You realize that in a world obsessed with contracts and reputations, scandal sheets were the great equalizer. They turned love into headlines, heartbreak into comedy, and private negotiations into public theatre. The torches gutter low, but the whispers never die. In this society, it seems, courtship was always one step away from the front page. You drift away from the market stalls where scandal sheets flutter and find yourself in a quieter bookshop. The shelves here groan, not with ledgers or sermons, but with stories, slim novels, serialized tales, ballads bound in cheap paper. The air smells of leather and dust, and you realize you've entered the century when literature itself began to disrupt the old order of contracts, smuggling passion back into the language of courtship. The mainstream fact by the 18th and 19th centuries, the rise of the novel profoundly shaped ideas of romance. Works like Samuel Richardson's Pamela, or Rousseau's Julie, or the new Heloise presented love as an emotional, transformative force, one that should matter as much as dowries and contracts. For the first time, young men and women consumed stories that elevated affection above calculation. You pull down a volume and leaf through the pages. A servant girl resists her master's advances, insisting that true virtue will lead to true marriage. A noblewoman defies her family to pursue passion. These fictional heroines seem far removed from the stiff daughters you've seen paraded through ledgers, and yet their words would have rippled into parlours and drawing rooms filling imaginations with the dangerous notion that love should matter. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some parents banned their daughters from reading novels, fearing the stories would inflame the imagination and make them discontent with practical matches. One father complained that his daughter, after devouring a romance, declared she would never marry unless for love. Historians still argue whether novels truly reshaped behavior or merely gave readers a temporary escape before returning to business as usual. You imagine a girl tucked under blankets with a candle, secretly reading Pamela, her eyes wide, her heart racing. Tomorrow her mother will speak of dowries and settlements, but tonight she dreams of letters written with trembling hands, of meetings in moonlit gardens, of passion that disregards coin. The irony is sharp. The same print culture that once dictated manners through etiquette manuals now undermines them with stories of rebellion. In one generation, pamphlets scolded, "Do not gaze too long at a maiden." In the next, novels sighed, "Lose yourself entirely in her gaze." And the ripples spread fast. Plays, operas, and ballads echoed these themes, turning love into a fashionable subject rather than a suspicious distraction. You picture a parlor where a young man quotes lines from a sentimental novel to impress his intended bride. Her mother frowns, muttering about impractical ideals, while the girl herself blushes, secretly hoping he means it. Of course, not everyone applauded. Moralists railed against novels, calling them frivolous, corrupting, even dangerous. One preacher thundered, "A girl who reads romances will scorn her duties and dream herself into ruin." You smirk at how familiar the warning sounds, like a modern parent worrying about teenagers and TikTok. Still, the shift was undeniable. By giving readers emotional models of love, literature cracked the icy facade of courtship as contract. It didn't erase the dowries or settlements, but it planted seeds of expectation, whispers of hope that maybe marriage could also be about joy. As you step out of the bookshop, the night feels different. You can almost hear the rustle of pages in every window, see the glow of candles where readers sit entranced. Contracts still bind families, but imagination has begun to rebel. For the first time in centuries, stories themselves are rewriting the rules of love. You leave the little bookshop and drift down a street where chimneys belch smoke and the rattle of carts echoes off brick walls. The cottages have multiplied, workshops hum late into the night, and you realize the world has shifted. This is the age of industry, where steam and wages begin to tug at the old scaffolding of courtship. Business still rules love, but the shape of that business is changing. The mainstream fact: by the 19th century, industrialization altered the dynamics of marriage. As young men and women left farms for factories and cities, they gained wages of their own. This new independence slowly loosened the grip of parental arrangements. Courtship began to tilt toward personal choice, even if families still cared deeply about class and money. You step into a textile mill where the air is thick with lint. A boy of 18 wipes sweat from his brow as he glances across the room at a girl tying threads. They exchange a shy smile while the overseer scowls. Here, courtship happens on the factory floor, not in parlours or at harvest dances. The wages in their pockets mean they might marry for affection rather than just parental command. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Victorian factories actually banned flirting on the job, posting rules against inappropriate attentions between workers. Violators were fined or dismissed. Imagine being docked a day's pay because you winked during a lunch break. Historians still argue whether these rules were about morality or about keeping productivity high. You walk into a city street where rows of boarding houses stand shoulder to shoulder. Young women sit by windows, sewing by lamplight. Young men crowd taverns after long shifts. The rituals of courtship shift accordingly, less arranged through family negotiations, more brokered in boarding house parlours or Sunday walks in smoky parks. Love may still stumble under class expectations, but the geography of opportunity has widened. And yet parents didn't vanish from the equation. Middle-class families still negotiated dowries and scrutinized suitors. A clerk with steady employment might be approved. A labourer with uncertain wages might be forbidden. You imagine a daughter pleading, "But he loves me," while her father counters, "Can he provide coal through winter?" The echo of old logic persists, now dressed in industrial terms. Still, the city gave cover for small rebellions. Couples met without chaperones in crowded streets. Dances in public halls allowed flirtation less supervised than in parlour courts. Letters zipped more easily through the penny post. And as wages spread, more women insisted on marrying later, refusing to wed until they had saved enough or felt ready. You picture a seamstress clutching her pay envelope on a Saturday, choosing whether to spend it on necessities or a ribbon for her hair. The ribbon wins. At the next dance, she twirls, her eyes bright, and across the hall a young man notices. No dowry ledger needed. Her wages and willpower buy her freedom to choose. But the Industrial Revolution also deepened divides. For the wealthy, contracts grew thicker, property more complex, inheritances tied up in railways and factories. For the poor, marriage could still mean pooling wages for survival, not passion. Courtship might be freer, but survival remained a contract written in soot and sweat. As you step back onto the smoky street, you sense the shift. Love no longer whispers only in gardens or under chaperones' watch. It sneaks into factory shifts, boarding house parlours, penny post letters. Business hasn't left marriage, but now it looks less like ledgers of land and more like coins in a pay envelope. The factory clamour fades as you wander into a quieter district, where gas lamps glow along broad boulevards. The houses here are tall and stern, with iron railings and polished brass knockers. You can almost hear the rustle of starched skirts and the clink of pocket watches. This is Victorian England, where courtship is drowning in paperwork. The industrial age may have loosened parental control, but the Victorians responded by tightening law's grip, rules, settlements, acts of parliament, turning marriage into a labyrinth of red tape. The mainstream fact: in the 19th century, legal reforms and growing bureaucracy codified marriage more rigidly than ever before. Laws like the Marriage Act of 1836 in England introduced civil marriage alongside church rights, while later reforms set minimum ages, standardized licenses, and restricted clandestine unions. What once could be whispered under a tree now required signatures, witnesses, and official seals. You step into a solicitor's office where piles of documents tower like tombstones. A clerk drones on. License fees, certificate copies, registration stamps. The couple sitting opposite look less like lovers and more like applicants for a mortgage. The bride fiddles with her parasol. The groom stares grimly at the ink. The romance has been filed in triplicate. Here's your quirky tidbit. In Victorian England, even the type of ink could matter. Legal clerks insisted that entries in marriage registers be written in permanent black ink, lest a scandalous groom try to erase his name later. Imagine proposing with one hand while the other checks whether your pen meets government standards. Historians still argue whether this obsession with documentation protected individuals or simply fed the bureaucratic beast of empire. And then came parliamentary debates. You picture grey-haired MPs arguing furiously over whether cousins should be allowed to marry, whether Catholics could wed Protestants, whether a widow could remarry without scandal. The chamber echoes with phrases like moral corruption and national decay, while outside in the streets, ordinary couples simply hope their paperwork is in order. The red tape tangled even further for women. Once married, wives in many jurisdictions lost control over their property under coverture laws, effectively merging their legal identity with their husbands. Marriage settlements might secure some independence, but often the fine print hemmed women in tighter than any dowry ledger. You imagine a woman staring at her marriage certificate, realizing it feels less like freedom and more like a surrender slip. And yet, love still tried to sneak in. The Victorians adored sentimental tokens, locks of hair in lockets, pressed flowers in prayer books, faded photographs tucked into wallets. Beneath the paperwork, these fragile keepsakes whispered of affection. One young bride might sign a contract in permanent ink, then tuck a violet into its folds, hoping it would preserve some humanity amid the clauses. The irony is sharp. Society had once worried about secret vows under oak trees. Now it worried about whether marriages were too public, too procedural, too open to scandal if improperly recorded. From whispered contracts to bureaucratic ones, the pendulum had swung with maddening force. As you step back onto the lamplit street, you notice couples strolling stiffly under the watchful gaze of neighbors. They talk of novels, dances, promenades, but always with one eye on propriety and another on the paperwork, waiting at the solicitor's desk. The night feels orderly, regulated, almost suffocating. You realize that in Victorian times, love wasn't just a matter of hearts. It was bound up in ink, statutes, signatures, and red tape. Even passion, it seemed, had to be filed neatly in the proper drawer. The lamp-lit boulevards fade as you step forward into the hum of the modern age, streetcars rattling, neon signs buzzing faintly, and the restless shuffle of crowds in cities that never quite sleep. You can almost hear the low thrum of engines and the chatter of cafes. Here, in the 20th and 21st centuries, the echoes of business-like courtship still linger, reshaped into prenups, dating profiles, and apps that turn desire into data points. The mainstream fact, even in the present day, marriage is still entangled with contracts. Prenuptial agreements, common in many countries, spell out how assets will be divided in case of divorce. Dating apps match people not by lineage or dowry, but by algorithms sorting through income levels, education, and lifestyle. The language of compatibility is still dressed in the vocabulary of economics. You pause at a cafe window where two people sit across from each other, sipping lattes. Their conversation hums with familiar rhythms. What do you do for work? Do you own or rent? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? They might believe they're chasing romance, but the questions echo the same practicality of dowries and contracts, only translated into LinkedIn chatter. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some modern wedding planners half-jokingly call prenups the love contract. They're signed with the same flourish as marriage settlements centuries ago, though now they include clauses about pets, debt, and even custody of frozen embryos. Historians still argue whether prenups liberate couples by clarifying expectations or poison marriages by reducing them to balance sheets. You scroll through your phone and laugh softly. Swipe left, swipe right. It's not so different from parents parading daughters at Monday marriage markets. The categories have changed. No one brags about 2 cows anymore. But the sorting remains. Income brackets, photographs, witty taglines. The stage has moved online, but the play is old. And yet, modern courtship also offers freedoms unimaginable to earlier generations. Couples can choose across class, race, and borders with a liberty that would have been scandalous in centuries past. Still, family expectations linger. Parents still ask sly questions at holiday dinners. Is he stable? Does she come from a good family? You realize that while the contracts are subtler, the logic persists. You picture a wedding lawyer poring over spreadsheets of assets while, in another room, a florist arranges roses and lilies for the ceremony. 2 different rituals, both equally crucial, both proving that marriage is still business wrapped in beauty. But love hasn't vanished. Just as in the village dance or the mill factory, affection sneaks through the seams. Couples meet through apps and genuinely fall for one another. Partners laugh at prenups even as they sign them. Families still cry at weddings, not over contracts, but over the fragile joy of hope. The modern street around you buzzes with contradiction, glowing billboards for diamond rings promising eternal love, law offices offering divorce mediation just a block away, cafes filled with couples in first-date awkwardness, jewelry shops filled with engagement rings, and banks quietly arranging joint accounts. As neon lights reflect in puddles at your feet, you realize the old dance never ended. Courtship is still part love story, part spreadsheet. The contracts are updated, the tools digital, but the tension remains eternal. Affection pulling one way, business tugging the other. The neon hum of the city softens as you walk further into the night. The streets thin, the traffic quiets, and soon you find yourself in a hushed park where the lamps cast gentle pools of light. The air feels slower here, the noise of contracts and negotiations fading until only your own footsteps remain. After tracing centuries of bargains, scandals, and signatures, you sense the story winding toward a quieter realization that love and contracts have always danced together, uneasy but inseparable. The mainstream fact historians agree that marriage across cultures and centuries has always balanced between economic function and emotional hope. The proportions shift, sometimes heavily weighted toward property, sometimes leaning into affection. But rarely has one existed without the shadow of the other. You pause at a bench where two figures sit hand in hand. Perhaps they are newly engaged, perhaps they are just beginning to dream. You know behind them lies a web of legalities, prenups, inheritance law, shared mortgages. But in this moment, their laughter is soft, their eyes bright, and you can almost believe affection outweighs everything else. Here's your quirky tidbit. Even today, some couples sign love contracts at workplaces to declare their relationships to HR. The idea would make a medieval matchmaker laugh and then nod approvingly, recognizing the continuity. Historians still argue whether we've truly broken free of marriage as business, or whether we've simply dressed it up in softer language, trading cows for condos, gloves for gym memberships. You lean back and let the centuries fold together. The dowry chests, the marriage markets, the widows negotiating, the lovers eloping to Gretna Green, they're all threads in the same tapestry. Each age finds its own way to merge affection with calculation, dream with duty. The tension never disappears, it only changes costume. The park grows quieter, a breeze stirs the trees. Somewhere a phone buzzes with a new dating notification, while in another home a lawyer slides a prenup across the table. And in countless kitchens, two people sit laughing over nothing, grateful for one another. The story has no neat resolution because the dance continues. You realize that to be human is to balance heart and ledger, always tugged in two directions, always hoping the scales tilt just enough toward love. Now the narration slows. The pace eases like the soft closing of a book. Sentences lengthen, soften, drift. The world of ledgers and lawyers fades into a blur of candlelight and whispers. You picture yourself lying back, the weight of history slipping gently away. Those families who argued over cattle and dowries, those kings who brokered castles through vows, those lovers who carved initials into bread crusts, they all dissolve into quiet memory. What remains is the hush of human voices across time, promising, bargaining, hoping. You realize it doesn't matter whether the gift was a glove or a prenup, whether the vow was made under a tree or in a courthouse. At the center, there was always a yearning for safety, for continuity, for love, however constrained. The night deepens, your eyelids grow heavy, the old contracts crumble into dust, leaving only the soft trace of affection that somehow survived them. So let yourself drift. Imagine the sound of distant bells, not tolling in stern authority, but ringing gently, like lullabies across centuries. Let the voices of matchmakers, lawyers, preachers, and poets fade into silence. What's left is only warmth, only the slow pulse of comfort. And as you sink deeper into rest, you carry with you the strange reassurance that love, however entangled, always found a way to slip through.